The worst kind of heartbreak is not being left. It is realizing you were never the priority while you were still holding on. I did not understand that sentence until I was lying in a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling that felt colder than the winter air outside. My name is Emma Collins, and 3 days ago I thought I still had a place in someone's life. 3 days ago I believed love was something you could hold on to if you tried hard enough. Now I know better. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of a monitor beside my bed. A thin curtain moved slightly every time the air conditioning turned on, brushing against the window like it was trying to escape the room. My arm still had a small 4-line, nothing serious, just enough to keep me here longer than I wanted. The nurse said I would be fine in a few days. Physically, yes. Emotionally, I was not so sure. I checked my phone for the 10th time that hour. No missed calls. No new messages that mattered. Only one from Jason Reed earlier that morning. Busy today. I will check on you later. That was all. No question about how I was feeling. No urgency. No sign that he was even thinking about me beyond obligation. I stared at those words until they stopped feeling like words and started feeling like distance. Jason had always been like that, I told myself. Busy. Focused. Important. That was the story I had used to explain everything. Until I could no longer ignore what busy really meant. A soft knock came at the door. I lifted my head slightly, expecting him. Hoping, despite everything, that maybe he had finally come. But it was only a nurse checking my vitals. She gave me a polite smile, adjusted my chart, and left without saying much. The room felt even emptier after she left. Somewhere outside my door, I could hear footsteps and distant voices from other patients and visitors. Life continued normally for everyone else. Just not for me. I turned my head toward the window. The city outside looked too alive for how still I felt inside. Cars moved. People walked. Lights flickered on and off in buildings far away. Everything kept going. Even without me. My phone buzzed again. My heart reacted. Before my mind could stop it. But it was not Jason. It was a notification from social media. A tagged photo. I should not have opened it. But I did. Jason was there. Sitting at a cafe table I recognized. And across from him was Chloe Bennett. Her hand lightly resting near his arm as they both smiled at something the camera had captured mid-moment. The caption read, "Some connections never fade." I read it once. Then again. My fingers tightened around the edge of the hospital blanket until the fabric wrinkled. I was not supposed to be there. I was supposed to be the one he worried about. The one he came to see. The one he chose. Instead, I was an afterthought in a life that was still smiling without me. The monitor beside me beeped steadily, indifferent to everything I was feeling. I set the phone down carefully on the bedside table, as if it might break if I held it any longer. And in that quiet hospital room, I finally admitted something I had been avoiding for far too long. I was not part of his priorities. I was part of his convenience. And somewhere deep inside me, something that had been quietly holding on finally started to let go. The next morning arrived without ceremony.
No dramati crueles ascen.
No sudden burst of strength. Just sunlight creeping through the hospital window and landing across the empty chair beside my bed. The same chair Jason was supposed to be sitting in. I woke up staring at it before I even opened my phone. For a second, half asleep, I almost imagined he had come during the night. But the chair remained exactly where it had been yesterday. Untouched. Empty. Waiting for someone who never arrived. A nurse entered carrying a small clipboard and a paper cup filled with medication. She smiled warmly. "Good morning, Emma. How are you feeling today?" I forced a small smile back. Better. It was easier than explaining the truth. Physically, I was improving. Emotionally, I felt like someone had quietly removed a piece of my life while I was not looking. After she left, I checked my phone again. One new message from Jason. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. "Sorry, things have been complicated. Hope you are feeling better." That was all. No call. No visit. No question asking if I needed anything. Just another message that felt more like a task completed than a person reaching out. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I opened social media again. I should have known better. But heartbreak has a way of making people search for proof they do not want to find. There were more photos. More comments. More smiles. Chloe standing beside Jason at a charity event. Chloe sitting with him at lunch. Chloe receiving flowers. Everywhere I looked, she was there. And everywhere she was, Jason seemed present in a way he had not been for me in months. Suddenly, memories began replaying themselves in my mind. Birthdays where he arrived late. Dinners canceled because something more important came up. Phone calls he promised to return but never did. I used to defend him. I used to tell myself successful people were busy. Loving someone meant understanding their schedule. Loving someone meant patience. Now, sitting alone in a hospital room, those explanations felt hollow. The door opened again. This time it was my friend Sarah carrying a small bouquet of grocery store flowers. Nothing expensive. Nothing extravagant. Just colorful daisies wrapped in brown paper. The sight of them almost made me cry. "You look terrible," she said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. I laughed despite myself. "Thank you." She placed the flowers beside the window. "Has he been here?" I already knew who she meant. The silence answered before I could. Sarah's expression changed immediately. Not surprised. Just disappointed. "Emma," she said carefully, "when someone shows you where you rank in their life, believe them." I looked away toward the city skyline. Those words landed harder than I expected. Because deep down I already knew they were true. Sarah stayed for an hour. We talked about small things. Work. Movies. The weather. She never forced the conversation toward Jason again. When she finally left, the room felt quieter than before. But something had changed. For the first time, I stopped waiting for my phone to light up. I stopped listening for footsteps outside my door. I stopped expecting him to choose me. And as evening settled across the city beyond my window, I realized something frightening and freeing at the same time. The person I had been waiting for was never coming. And maybe that was exactly what I needed to finally start finding my way back to myself. The day I was discharged from the hospital arrived with surprising quiet.
No dramaticudie.
No emotional reunion waiting outside. Just a stack of paperwork, a nurse wishing me well, and a gray February sky hanging over the city. I packed the few things I had brought with me into a worn canvas bag and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before leaving. 3 days earlier, I had entered this room believing I had someone waiting for me. Now I was walking out understanding that sometimes the hardest truth is not losing a person. It is realizing they stopped choosing you long before you noticed. My phone remained silent. Jason knew I was being discharged that morning. I had told him the date myself. He had responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji. Nothing more. No offer to pick me up. No question about whether I needed help getting home. Just a symbol on a screen. I stepped outside the hospital entrance and pulled my coat tighter against the cold wind. Taxis passed. People hurried along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life moved with purpose around me while I stood there deciding what came next. For a second, I almost called Jason. Not because I wanted to hear his voice. Because old habits are difficult to break. Then I remembered the photo. The messages. The empty chair beside my hospital bed. My hand slowly lowered. I ordered a rideshare instead. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every street seemed familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. When I finally reached my apartment building, I climbed the stairs slowly and unlocked the door. The silence inside greeted me immediately. No flowers. No note. No evidence that anyone had worried about me while I was gone. I set my bag down and walked through the small apartment. The place looked exactly as I had left it. Yet somehow it felt different. Like I was seeing it through new eyes. Later that evening my phone finally rang. Jason. His name. Peered across the screen. I stared at it until the ringing almost stopped. Then I answered. "Hey," he said casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. "You are home." I closed my eyes briefly. "Yes." "Good. Sorry things have been hectic." His voice carried that familiar distracted tone. In the background I could hear restaurant noise. Glasses. Conversations. Laughter. He was out somewhere. "How are you feeling?" he asked. The question arrived days too late. "Better." A pause followed. Not a meaningful pause. The kind that comes when someone has already moved on to their next thought. "That is good," he said. "Listen, Chloe has been going through a difficult time recently. I have been helping her get settled back in the city. There it was. The explanation I never requested. The justification I already understood. I walked toward the window and looked out at the lights across the street. Jason, I said quietly, do you remember when I told you I was scared before going into the hospital? Silence. Then, of course. But his answer came too quickly. Too automatically. He did not remember. I could hear it. You promised you would be there, I continued. Another pause. Longer this time. Emma, you know things have been complicated. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I suddenly realized how many times I had heard that sentence. Complicated. Busy. Difficult. Later. Someday. All the words people use when they want understanding without giving effort. I leaned my forehead lightly against the cool glass. I know, I said softly. And for the first time I truly meant it. Because I finally understood exactly where I stood in his life. Not beside him. Not with him. Somewhere behind everything else. When the call ended a few minutes later, I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not beg for more attention. I simply placed my phone on the table and sat quietly in the fading evening light. Outside, the city continued moving forward. And for the first time in a very long time, I decided that maybe I should too. The next morning arrived with a strange kind of emptiness I could no longer pretend not to notice. It was not the same emptiness I felt in the hospital where everything had been physical and immediate. This was quieter. More permanent. Like something inside me had stopped expecting things to return to the way they used to be. I woke up early without needing an alarm. The apartment was still dark except for a thin line of light coming through the curtains. For a moment I lay still and listened to nothing. No messages. No calls. No interruptions. Just silence that no longer felt unbearable. It felt honest. I got up slowly, made coffee I did not really want, and stood by the kitchen counter while it cooled. My phone stayed face down on the table. I did not check it. Not immediately. That alone felt unfamiliar. When I finally picked it up, there were the usual notifications. A few work emails. A reminder from the clinic about a follow-up appointment. And one message I did not expect. From Sarah. Are you okay? I saw Jason and Chloe together again yesterday. I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it without replying. Not because I was angry. Because I realized I no longer had anything to say about it. By midday, I left the apartment. I told myself it was for groceries, but I knew it was more than that. I walked through the city slowly, noticing things I had not paid attention to before. The way people moved with direction. The way no one was waiting for anyone else to define their path. Somewhere between the market and the subway entrance, I stopped in front of a small cafe I used to pass every day but never entered. I stood there longer than I meant to. Then I went inside. The warmth hit me immediately. Soft lighting. Quiet conversations. The smell of coffee and baked bread. I ordered something simple and sat by the window. I did not check my phone once. For the first time in days, I was not measuring my worth against someone else's absence. That is when I saw him. Not Jason. A man I had never met before. He was sitting across the cafe working on a laptop, but he kept glancing up as if he noticed something unusual. Eventually, he stood and walked toward my table. I almost looked away, but something about his presence felt calm rather than intrusive. Sorry, he said politely, stopping a few feet away. I do not mean to bother you, but I think I have seen you before. I hesitated. I do not think so. He smiled lightly, not insisting. Maybe not directly. I work with the Grant Group downtown. I think I have seen you near the building a few times. That name meant nothing to me at first. I simply nodded, unsure why this conversation was happening. I am Alexander Grant, he added. There was no pressure in his tone. No expectation. Just introduction. Emma Collins, I replied automatically. He nodded as if remembering it. Nice to meet you, Emma. Then he paused, glancing briefly at my untouched coffee. You look like someone who is thinking too much about things you should not be carrying alone. The words should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, they surprised me, because he was not asking questions. He was simply observing. I looked down at my cup. I guess everyone thinks too much about something, I said quietly. He considered that for a moment. True, he said. But not everyone stays stuck there. There was a short silence between us. Not awkward. Just still. Then he nodded slightly toward the door. If you ever want to step outside of whatever is keeping you here, the Grant Group is hiring in multiple departments. No pressure. Just an option. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was the first time in a long time someone had offered me something without expectation attached to it. I will think about it, I said. And for once I meant that too. When he left and returned to his table, I sat back and looked out the window. The city outside looked the same as always. But something in me had shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Not dramatically enough to call it change yet. But enough to notice that I was no longer waiting for a call that would not come. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, I was beginning to understand that silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was space. And space, I was starting to realize, was where something new could finally begin. The following days did not feel like a dramatic turning point. There was no sudden transformation, no cinematic moment where everything changed at once. Instead, it felt like something quieter. Like my life was slowly being rewritten in small, almost invisible decisions I was making without realizing it. I went back to work. Not because I felt fully ready, but because staying at home made the silence inside my apartment feel louder than anything outside. My coworkers greeted me with polite concern, careful not to ask too many questions. I appreciated that more than I expected. No one mentioned Jason directly, but I could feel the curiosity behind their eyes. People always notice when something breaks, even if they do not say it out loud. At lunch, I sat alone for the first time in a long time and realized it did not feel as uncomfortable as it used to. I ate slowly, scrolling through my phone without urgency. Jason had not called again. Not since the cafe. Not since I stopped waiting for him. That thought no longer hurt the way it used to. It just existed like background noise I was learning to ignore. After work that evening, I found myself walking past the Grant Group building again. I did not plan it. My feet simply carried me there. The building was taller than I remembered from the outside. All glass and light reflecting the setting sun. People in expensive suits moved in and out with purpose. Everyone looked like they belonged somewhere. I stood across the street for a moment, unsure why I had stopped. Then I heard a voice behind me. You actually came back. I turned slightly. Alexander Grant was standing a few steps away, holding a coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. He looked the same as before. Calm, observant, unrushed. I did not plan to, I admitted honestly. He nodded as if that answer made sense. Most people do not plan the things that change their direction. I looked back at the building. I am not sure I am looking for change. That is usually when it starts, he said simply. There was no pressure in his tone. No attempt to convince me. Just observation again. He gestured slightly toward the entrance. I have a meeting upstairs. You are welcome to come in if you want to see what the place is like. Or you can stay here. Both are fine. That kind of choice felt unfamiliar. Hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. We entered the building together. The lobby was quiet but alive with movement. People speaking softly into headsets, others reviewing documents on tablets, glass elevators rising and falling like slow pulses of the building itself. No one stopped to stare. No one questioned my presence. It felt strangely neutral, like I was not being judged or defined. Alexander walked beside me toward the elevators. What do you actually do here? I asked. He smiled slightly. Investment decisions. Company acquisitions. Sometimes restructuring failing businesses. I nodded slowly. That sounds complicated. It is, he said. Then he glanced at me briefly. But not everything complicated is bad. The elevator doors opened. We stepped inside. The ride upward was smooth and quiet. I watched the numbers rise, reflecting faintly in the mirrored surface. Why did you talk to me in the cafe? I asked suddenly. He did not answer immediately. Because you looked like someone who had been waiting for something that was never coming, he said finally. The honesty of it made me look away for a moment. And now? I asked quietly. Now, he said, you look like someone deciding whether to stay that way. The elevator slowed. When the doors opened, the floor was open, modern, filled with glass walls and soft lighting. People greeted him as we stepped out, but he acknowledged them without stopping. "You do not have to decide anything today," he said as we walked. "But if you are serious about not going back to what hurt you, there are options here. Real ones." I stopped walking for a second. "You are offering me a job?" He shook his head slightly. "I am offering you a direction. The job comes later." That distinction stayed with me longer than anything else he had said. Because no one had ever offered me direction without expectation attached to it. Not Jason. Not anyone I had known before him. I looked out through the glass wall at the city below. Somewhere out there my old life still existed. Jason still existed in it. But for the first time I did not feel pulled back toward it. I felt something else instead. Not certainty. Not confidence. Just possibility. And that was enough to make me stay a little longer. Over the next few weeks, my life began changing in ways that were almost impossible to notice day by day, but impossible to ignore when I looked back. I started spending more time at Grant Group. First, it was only a few visits. Then it became conversations. Then opportunities. Alexander never pushed me toward anything. That was what made his influence so different from everyone else I had known. He never told me who I should become. He simply kept opening doors and allowing me to decide whether I wanted to walk through them. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in a conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan, listening to a group of executives discuss a creative branding project for one of their companies. I was not there because of connections. I was there because Alexander had seen my illustration portfolio and asked whether I would be interested in consulting on a visual campaign. The idea still felt unreal. A month earlier, I had been sitting alone in a hospital room wondering why I was not important enough for someone to show up. Now people were asking for my ideas. The difference felt almost unsettling. When the meeting ended, I remained seated for a moment, gathering my notes. The room slowly emptied until only Alexander remained. He stood near the window, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket. "You were the most prepared person in that room," he said casually. I looked up in surprise. I was nervous the entire time. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Most capable people are." I laughed softly. "That does not sound very encouraging." "It is reality," he replied. "Confidence is useful. Preparation is more valuable." His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, I stopped by a small bookstore near my apartment. It was one of my favorite places, quiet and familiar. As I browsed through a shelf of illustrated novels, my phone vibrated unexpectedly. I glanced down and froze. Jason. For a moment, I simply stared at his name on the screen. It had been nearly 3 weeks since our last real conversation. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks during which I had stopped organizing my life around his attention. The phone continued ringing, then stopped. A second later, a message appeared. "Can we talk?" I looked at the words without feeling the reaction I expected. There was no rush of hope.
No immediate anxiety.
Just curiosity. I slipped the phone back into my purse without replying. As I continued walking through the bookstore, I realized something important. The message would have changed my entire day a month ago. It would have sent me spiraling through questions and possibilities. Now it felt like a voice from a room I had already left. Outside, the evening sky was turning deep blue. Streetlights reflected across rain-dark sidewalks as people hurried home after work. I stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a new sketchbook and paused beneath the glow of a storefront window. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Jason. "I miss you." I closed my eyes briefly. Not because the words hurt, because they arrived so late. Somewhere across the city, he was finally looking for me. Meanwhile, somewhere else across the same city, Alexander Grant was helping me discover a version of myself I had forgotten existed. As I continued walking home through the cool evening air, I realized the most surprising part of all. My life was no longer revolving around the question of whether someone would choose me. For the first time in years, I was beginning to choose myself. There is a strange moment that happens after heartbreak. Not when the pain first arrives. Not when the tears finally stop. It happens later, when the person who ignored your absence suddenly notices your silence. I did not understand that feeling until Jason started calling every day. The messages came first, then missed calls, then longer messages. Can we meet? Please talk to me. I think we need to clear things up. Weeks earlier, those words would have controlled my emotions. I would have analyzed every sentence and searched for hidden meaning between each line. Now I simply read them and placed my phone back down. Not out of anger. Out of peace. My life had become fuller than the space he left behind. The project at Grant Group continued growing. What started as a small consultation had expanded into several creative campaigns. I was working with talented people who respected my ideas. More importantly, I was beginning to respect them myself. One Friday afternoon, I found myself attending a private networking event organized by Grant Group. The venue overlooked the Hudson River, with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the sunset across the water. The room was filled with entrepreneurs, investors, founders, and executives from companies I had only heard about before. A few months ago, I would have felt completely out of place. Now I felt something different. Not belonging yet, but possibility. Alexander introduced me to people throughout the evening without exaggerating my accomplishments. He never presented me as someone he had rescued. He introduced me as someone whose work mattered. That distinction meant more than he probably realized. Emma designed the campaign that increased engagement by 40%. I overheard him telling one executive, not Emma needed help. Not Emma had potential. Just facts. Respect. Recognition. As the evening continued, I noticed something surprising. People genuinely wanted to speak with me. They asked questions about my ideas, my creative process, my goals. Nobody cared who I was dating. Nobody measured my value through someone else's attention. For the first time in a very long time, I felt seen as a complete person. Later that evening, while standing near the balcony overlooking the river, my phone vibrated again. Jason. I almost ignored it. Then curiosity won. I answered. Hello. Silence greeted me for a second before his voice appeared. Emma. He sounded relieved just hearing my name. Thank you for answering. I looked out at the lights reflecting across the water. What do you need, Jason? Another pause. I saw your photos. I frowned slightly. Photos. The event tonight. Understanding arrived immediately. Someone had posted pictures online. In several of them, Alexander and I were standing together during conversations. Nothing unusual. Nothing intimate. Just two people attending the same event. Yet somehow those images had traveled across the city and reached Jason. You look different, he said quietly. The statement surprised me. Different how? Happy. The word lingered between us. I closed my eyes briefly, because that was not what I expected him to notice. Not the elegant venue. Not the executives. Not Alexander. Happiness. The thing he had stopped paying attention to long ago. I am doing well, I replied honestly. His breathing changed slightly on the other end of the line. Emma, I think I made a mistake. Those words should have felt satisfying. Instead they felt sad. Not for me. For him. Because I could hear genuine regret for the first time. Real regret always arrives after certainty disappears. Maybe, I said softly. But mistakes do not always get reversed. Silence followed. Longer this time. He finally spoke. Can we meet? I looked through the glass toward the crowded room behind me. Alexander was speaking with several executives across the venue. Completely unaware of this conversation. Completely unaware that he had become the dividing line between my old life and my new one. Not tonight, I answered. Then I ended the call gently. When I slipped the phone back into my purse, I noticed something unexpected. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. And standing there beneath the lights reflecting across the river, I realized that Jason was finally seeing my value at the exact moment I had stopped needing him to. The funny thing about moving forward is that you rarely notice the distance until someone from your past tries to pull you back. After the networking event, Jason became impossible to ignore. The messages continued. Then came emails. Then flowers delivered to my apartment building that I never asked for. None of it felt romantic. It felt urgent. As if he had suddenly discovered a fire after spending months pretending there was no smoke. I did not respond. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I needed silence more than explanations. A few days later, I arrived at Grant Group early for a strategy meeting. The The city was still waking up, sunlight reflecting off glass towers as commuters filled the sidewalks below. I stepped out of the elevator carrying a portfolio case and nearly stopped walking. Jason was standing in the lobby. For a second, neither of us moved. He looked tired, not physically exhausted, emotionally unsettled, like someone who had been replaying the same mistake for weeks. "Emma," he said quietly. Hearing my name in his voice felt different now. Familiar but distant. I remained where I was. "How did you know I would be here?" He hesitated. I asked around. That answer alone told me how desperate he had become. The old Jason would never have admitted that. He took a step closer. "Can we talk?" I glanced around the lobby. Employees moved through the space carrying coffee and laptops. Nobody paid us much attention. Life continued around us. "We are talking," I said calmly. He swallowed hard. "Not like this." For a moment I saw the man I used to love. Not the version who ignored me in the hospital. Not the version who disappeared whenever Chloe needed attention. Just the person I had once imagined a future with. That made this harder, not easier. "What do you want to say?" I asked. He looked at me for several seconds before answering. I was wrong. The honesty surprised me. There were no excuses attached.
No complicate de explanations.
Just 4 words. "I know," I replied softly. Pain crossed his face. "Emma, I thought I had more time." I almost smiled sadly. People always think that. More time to call. More time to apologize. More time to choose differently. Until one day the time is gone. "You did," I said. "You just spent it somewhere else." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Jason lowered his gaze. For the first time he had no argument. No defense. Nothing to protect him from reality. "I miss you," he said quietly. I took a slow breath. Months ago those words would have shattered me. Today they only made me feel tired. "You miss the version of me that stayed no matter what happened," I answered. "That is not the same thing." Silence settled between us. Not angry silence. Final silence. Before either of us could speak again, another voice entered the conversation. "Good morning, Emma." I turned slightly. Alexander had just crossed the lobby carrying a tablet and a coffee. His expression remained calm when he noticed Jason.
No surprise. No tensión.
Just awareness. "Good morning," I replied. Jason looked between us immediately. Something in his expression shifted. Not jealousy exactly. Understanding. For the first time he was seeing the life I had built while he was looking somewhere else. Alexander stopped beside me but did not interrupt. He simply waited, giving me the choice. That was what made him different. The choice was always mine. Jason noticed that too. I could see it. He looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I understand," he said. Whether he truly did or not, I could not tell. But something had changed. The fight had left his eyes. The certainty that I would always be there had finally disappeared. "Take care of yourself, Emma," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked toward the revolving doors. I watched him leave without chasing after him, without calling his name, without questioning my decision. The doors spun once. Then he was gone. Beside me, Alexander remained silent, respecting the moment, respecting me. And as sunlight filled the lobby behind us, I realized some endings are not dramatic. They do not explode. They simply arrive. Quietly. Like a door closing after someone finally understands they no longer belong on the other side. People think healing feels like victory. They imagine a finish line. A perfect moment where all the pain disappears and everything finally makes sense. The truth is quieter than that. Healing feels like waking up one day and realizing that someone who once occupied every corner of your mind now only appears occasionally, like a distant memory passing through. Several months passed after that morning in the Grant Group lobby. Spring slowly gave way to summer. The city felt brighter somehow. Or maybe I was finally noticing the light again. My work continued growing beyond anything I could have imagined a year earlier. The creative campaigns I helped develop reached national audiences. New opportunities appeared almost every week. Some came from Grant Group. Others came from people I had met through the network Alexander had introduced me to. Every new project reminded Me of something important. My value had always existed. I simply spent too long waiting for someone else to recognize it. One evening I stood on the rooftop terrace of a charity event overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The air was warm, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and music from streets far below. Around me, guests moved through conversations and laughter, enjoying the evening. I held a glass of sparkling water and looked out at the city that had witnessed every version of me. The insecure version, the heartbroken version, the version learning how to stand alone, and now this one, the version finally at peace. Footsteps approached from behind. I smiled before turning because I already knew who it was. Alexander stepped beside me and rested his hands lightly against the railing. Neither of us spoke immediately. Silence had never been uncomfortable with him. That was one of the things I appreciated most. Beautiful view, he said eventually. I nodded. It is. He glanced toward me. You seem happy. I laughed softly. People keep saying that. Maybe because it is true. I looked back toward the skyline. The buildings glowed against the darkening sky. Thousands of lights. Thousands of stories unfolding at the same time. I think I finally understand something, I said quietly. What is that? I smiled. The right people do not make you earn your place in their lives. Alexander remained silent for a moment before nodding slowly. No, he said. They do not. The simplicity of his answer made me smile even more. Across the city somewhere, Jason was living his own life. Occasionally I heard updates through mutual friends. Nothing dramatic. Nothing tragic. Just life continuing forward. I wished him well. And for the first time I genuinely meant it. Because forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened. It is about refusing to carry it forever. A gentle breeze moved across the rooftop, lifting a few strands of my hair. Alexander looked toward the horizon before speaking again. If you could go back and change everything, would you? The question lingered between us. I thought about the hospital room, the empty chair, the unanswered calls, the heartbreak that once felt impossible to survive. Then I thought about the woman standing here now, stronger, wiser, whole.
No, y answara tunasli.
Because if none of that happened, I would never have found myself. Alexander smiled, not because he was surprised, because he understood. We stood there together as the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. And in that moment, I realized the greatest love story of my life was never about finding someone who chose me over everyone else. It was about finally choosing myself. Everything that came after that was simply a gift.